Hello guys and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the Calgary Flames and more huge trades that they could be making throughout the next year that could fully tear down this team. We've already seen Calgary make a ton of deals over the last year, stripping it down, retooling, but it seems like the Flames aren't done to making major deals, and involving some of their bigger players, they're on the trade block and could get dealt soon. So how much more of a fire sale does this Flames team have in store? Where could these big players go, and what could their prices look like? Well, make sure you watch till the end to see if your team could end up getting them, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. Now, I get what you're probably thinking. How is it possible that Calgary still has more players to sell, especially with what we've seen over the past year? Even during the season last year, they were by far the team that sold the most. In last year's offseason, we saw them trade Tyler Toffoli to the Devils in exchange getting Graviteh and a pick, which worked out pretty well for them. And then during the season, they traded Nikita Zadorov, Elias Lindholm, Tanev, and Noah Hanifin, all two pretty major deals. Now, we could argue in some of these trades whether the value was truly there, but at the end of the day, the Calgary Flames were selling more than practically anybody and rebuilding more than practically anybody. But I think the writing was on the wall for this Flames team. Really, after that incredible 2022 regular season, they really have not had any bits of prolonged success. And they were in a spot where they were in the mediocrity in the middle of the NHL and not really showing any improvement whatsoever. And especially with the core pieces they lost, I didn't think they were going anywhere. The Flames management obviously saw that, and they made a huge pivot. It's hard for a lot of teams, especially coming out of the pandemic years, especially in Canada, to go out and rebuild like the Calgary Flames have. I get it. There's financial incentives here to try to make the playoffs, try to be as competitive as possible, and it takes a lot of balls to go out there and trade basically everybody possible. But that's what we've seen the Calgary Flames do, and it doesn't seem like they're done yet. And recently we had David Pagnotta going on NHL Network talking about the Flames' plans for the foreseeable future, and it revealed some pretty interesting details.
Craig Conroy's phone lines are wide open. His door to his office is open. You've got Nazem Kadri that they are willing to trade. Now, Naz has a no movement clause. My understanding is he would be willing to go a little bit more east, not necessarily back home to Toronto. In addition to him, Rasmus Andersson, they're willing to take calls still on Anderson. He has another year left on his contract, has some no trade protection, but there's some belief within the Flames that this might be his last season as a Calgary Flame, that the Flames will be seriously looking at moving him. MacKenzie Weegar generated some interest over the summer as well. I believe St. Louis, before they went the direction of Philip Broberg, were kicking tires on that. I know around the draft there were some discussions. Calgary willing to listen on Weegar as well.
So there is a lot there, not just on key players, but also the Flames' philosophy. And we get great indication there that the Flames aren't done with this retool, rebuild, whatever they want to call it. They're potentially selling more of their top end players, which is pretty big news. Now, the big one that I want to talk about first here is Nazem Kadri. I think he was somebody that I think a lot of us assumed would be one of the few players that Calgary wouldn't trade, especially when you consider just how good his last season was. But in terms of the contract situation at 33 years old, he's somebody that's making $7 million, but as of right now has a full no move clause. In 2027, it would start to turn into a 13-team no trade list, so a modified no trade clause. But as of right now, it's a full no moves, which would make Kadri have all of the momentum and all of the decision making here. But the way that Pagnotta was wording it, talking about how Kadri might want to go to a team out east, means that it's not just Calgary shopping him and seeing what happens. It's also got some support from Kadri's camp as well, which means that this whole thing is a lot farther along than we thought. You can see what he's been able to accomplish in his time with both Colorado and Calgary over the past couple of years. He was an absolute beast back in 2022, getting 87 points in 71 games. That got him this big paycheck with the Calgary Flames. And in the first year, having regressed back to his usual self, around 56 points in 82 games. But this sophomore season with Calgary was a lot more successful and really quite underrated in my opinion. He got 75 points, 29 goals in 82 games, and was a pretty huge player on this Flames offense. It didn't really have much going on for itself. If you're able to get a 2022 or 2024 type of Nazem Kadri, this is one of the more underrated players in the NHL, I would say right now. And even though that cap hit is going to be really interesting, I think there's a lot of teams out there that would be able to stomach it, especially with Kadri being a natural center, somebody that can plug and play right there, bring some offense, bring some great playmaking. That to me, I think it's going to be pretty enticing for a lot of folks out there, especially with his success as well as a Stanley Cup champion and what he can bring. It was a reason why the Flames Flames brought him on in the first place, and a reason why a lot of suitors might be out there for him as well in a trade. Now, the interesting thing here is that if Kadri were to be dealt, apparently he'd want to go to the Eastern Conference. He mentions not Toronto to preface that, which I think makes sense. I don't think even the Leafs would want to do that again. But going to the Eastern Conference is interesting because there's a couple teams out there that could be in on him. One team that would be fascinating is the Carolina Hurricanes. I think they're one of the teams that would probably wait on a Kadri deal the most, though. They would have to be patient because right now their cap situation would not really be able to afford Kadri too well. But I could see a situation where maybe next offseason, if they run it back and it doesn't work out again, they maybe try to improve that center core for good. I mean, right now they're trying to work with Kotkaniemi and Stahl and Drury as they do, but I think Kadri could be really interesting as a second line center behind Sebastian Aho. And I think there is a situation where maybe you see a Kotkaniemi for Kadri type of exchange. But even though I think it is more realistic for Carolina to wait until the extra cap is there and just offload Kotkaniemi by himself, it is possible for them to just make a deal right now if they really wanted to and still make the cap work. With Kadri making $7 million, you got Kotkaniemi at $4.8 million and also Freddie Anderson at $3.4. If just those two guys were to move, then there's your cap space. Obviously, it's a lot easier said than done. You got, of course, Freddie Anderson, who has a modified no trade clause that he could have easily the Calgary Flames on that list. He probably does, and that would complicate things. But in terms of the cap, there are solutions here for both of these teams to make it work if they wanted to. And I think Kadri especially would really like to go to the Carolina Hurricanes as opposed to Calgary. Another team I could see working out is potentially the Flyers, at least in terms of center position need. This really all depends on how much they want to fast track their rebuild, and it could be ridiculous to ask them to bring on that type of cap hit. But if they want to add a center, if they want to add a big time one, especially with Sean Couturier regressing and having the injuries he has, if they want to get a big time center to have with Matvei Michkov, immediately Kadri would be a pretty enticing option. I mean, you just look at that center situation right now, and I mean, Morgan Frost has had some great moments, but also some inconsistencies. You got Scott Laughton as a center right now, Ryan Poehling. I mean, it is not the greatest group out there. And even though you have players coming up like Jet Luchenko in the future, they're going to take some serious time. Meanwhile, Kadri could be right there for them now. We'll see. It could be an interesting ad, though, if they want to get better for the now. One team that I think a lot of you guys might say it could be a contender for Kadri is the Boston Bruins. I would be a little bit more hesitant towards that. I think with the Bruins, their center situation is a little bit underrated, honestly, at this point. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of the Elias Lindholm contract, I still think he can be a good player for them and fill a role there as a first-line center. And you also got Charlie Coyle, who had an incredible 2024, an extremely underrated season, and Matthew Poitras as well, factoring in as a center for the future, who will hopefully be there in a fixture already in the middle six. I think maybe a year ago before they got Lindholm, I think Kadri could have made a lot of sense, but right now I'm not as sure. Another team that could be in the maybes is the New Jersey Devils. Again, if they're wanting to add some center stability, potentially have Jack Hughes on the wing full time, maybe they could end up having Kadri, but I think again, this is another one kind of like what we see with the Carolina situation, where more likely I think it's next offseason that we were to see a deal. But I think for the Devils, it could be interesting to have Hischier as that first line center. You also have Kadri as that second line center, and then Haula as that definitive third line center, and balance out the center situation a lot better than they have it right now. It would be a big cap commitment though, and that I think is the big reason why New Jersey won't pursue it too much as they maybe would otherwise. But this whole situation has just been fascinating to me, man, about Kadri, where he could go, what the trade could potentially look like. We haven't even touched on that. Let me know down below your thoughts on that too, because I think it could range in a big amount of possibilities. I think because of the cap hit, it's probably a little bit lower than some people are expecting, but still a pretty decent haul. Now, that's not the only player that we want to talk about here with Calgary as well, because there's a couple other players that David Pagnotta mentioned. You also got, of course, Rasmus Andersson, who is a big one, and maybe a little bit more, even more likely than Kadri is even. And that's mostly because of Andersson's contract. Right now, he's making $4.55 million for this year and next. I think a big reason why we saw a lot of trade rumors regarding him at last year's trade deadline is because after that, his modified no trade clause does kick in. You see on July 1st, he submits a 16 no trade list. It isn't insane or anything, but it does limit the options that the Flames have. But Andersson, I think, is the big piece here for the Flames that is most likely to get dealt. Since an offensive D, he stayed relatively consistent, especially regarding Calgary's success over the past few years. 50 points in 2022, 49 points in 2023, down 10 points to 39 this last year, but also the Calgary Flames were the Calgary Flames. Not a lot of offensive pieces to set up to. But I think the reason why Andersson is going to be so valuable in this market is because of that cap hit. We've seen over the past few years, players like Hagel go for way more than expected because of the lower cap hit they provide. And in Andersson's case, as a top 4 offensive D, to only be being paid $4.5 million, I think is really enticing for a lot of contenders out there, and means that Calgary might not even have to retain salary or bring a big cap load back in a deal, and that maximizes the return quite a lot. There's a couple of teams I think make a lot of sense for Rasmus Andersson. First is the St. Louis Blues, who I think are always trying to get better, always try to be a contender, even when they might not be at that level. But we've seen them really try to retool that defense and switch out a lot over the last year, getting Philip Broberg, of course, but also bringing on Scott Perunovich full-time as a starter, and he's been solid in that role. But I think they could use even more differences, and I think especially with the aging core they have, they'll want to add a player like Andersson, who's right in the prime of his career as an offensive D. I think he's the exact type of defenseman that they need more of. I mean, they have Falk, they have Krug, but they've had some iffy health injuries, and of course, they've been aging. They've been at the tail end of their careers. In Andersson, you got a top-tier player here and somebody that St. Louis could really work off of. I also think, especially as a potential trade deadline piece, he makes a lot of sense for the Winnipeg Jets. They already have Neil Pionk on the right side, sure, but I think the Jets are going to want to add to this defense this trade deadline and throughout the year, especially if they're going to be as competitive as they were this last season. The Jets are going to want to add an Andersson. I think if he doesn't have them on the trade list, which could be a possibility, if he doesn't, though, I think we could see a deal here. And then, of course, we have the team that was talked about the most with Andersson at this last trade deadline, and that is the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think they're an incredible fit for Andersson in terms of teams out there wanting to contend that could really use him the most. I mean, they could use another offensive D, and especially considering their iffy confidence in players like Timothy Liljegren, I could absolutely see a swap where it's Andersson for Liljegren and a pick potentially, and I think the Leafs are the more likely teams to potentially extend Rasmus Andersson after they trade for him. And I think he'd be a pretty easily fittable player on that defense and on that right side, which I think needs more offense. But now going on to the last player that we saw David Pagnotta mention, and that is MacKenzie Weegar. I mean, Kadri was somebody that we didn't really expect the Flames to move, but Weegar especially is a pretty big surprise. He mentions, interestingly, that St. Louis was in on him before they went for Philip Broberg instead, which I think makes a lot of sense and is a reason why I think they could be in on Rasmus Andersson as well. But MacKenzie Weegar is an incredible top-end D and somebody that, even though in Calgary has had some inconsistencies here and there, I still think can be up to that level on a contending team in a more suitable role for him. I think leading a franchise isn't the right space for him, but I think as a number 2 to a solid number 1, Weegar would be perfect for a lot of teams out there. Another thing is regarding his trade protection, he has a no trade clause right now, so he would have to sign any potential deal that ends up happening. Once it hits 2027, though, he goes to a 10-team no trade list, so a little bit more manageable, which I think is a reason why we might not see a trade, but disregarding the trade protection, Weegar would be an incredible add out there for a lot of contenders. He makes a pretty reasonable cap hit work at $6.25 million. I think for a top-end D, that's about as good as you can get in this league, and it's a reason why I think a trade is a lot more likely. Teams are going to want that cap hit. They're going to want that on their top end of the defense, and Weegar brings that. You can see over the last couple of years, he's really developed well offensively. This last year, getting 20 goals, 52 points in 82 games. I think defensively is still where Weegar can be best at, but it's nice to see him really develop that with the Calgary Flames, and that's a tool to his arsenal that other teams could use. Now, just like Andersson, there's 3 teams that make a lot of sense for Weegar, whether it's now or in the future, and it's actually 3 different teams here. First, I got the Nashville Predators, who I think could really use a fantastic player to pair with Roman Josi again. They have tried to do that in Brady Shea. We'll see how successful that ends up being, but if they really want to make that defense a lot more scary, Weegar, I think, will be fascinating there, and I think they do have the prospects to make a deal work. I also think Utah, with how aggressive they were trading for Mikhail Sergachev, might not be done either. I think they could add a player like a Weegar onto that defense again and add to it in an even bigger way. They have the prospect pool as well, the top end. They have some absolutely incredible game-breaking pieces that no Calgary would absolutely adore. And I also think the Detroit Red Wings, they've been looking for a Moritz Seider pairing, a Moritz Seider pairmate, and it just hasn't worked out with many players out there. They've tried Ben Sherratt, but I think that's anchoring Seider's potential. Weegar and Seider, I think, is a lot better, and man, I think Detroit could really use that presence on the defense. A top-end guy, finally, that they can rely upon, because right now, Jeff Petrie, Eric Gustafsson, come on, Steve. But of course, we know it is going to be a pretty big asking price, with Weegar being a big part, of course, of the Jonathan Huberdeau and Matthew Tkachuk trade. I think Weegar is probably going to command a top prospect and likely a first-round pick as well. So it would be a big ask for a lot of teams out there. But for these teams looking to really improve, get over that hump, especially in the cases of Nashville, Detroit, Utah, all teams that want to take those next steps, Weegar will be an incredible piece to add and the exact type of presence they might need. But on top of Calgary getting a ton of picks and prospects from the deals that we saw over the last year, I think in Kadri's case, you could get a second and a big prospect back. In Andersson's case, you probably could get a first-round pick back as well. In a Weegar's case, maybe a first-round pick plus on top of that. And to me, I think for the Flames, even though I wouldn't trade all three of these guys, I think at least one of them are going to be dealt, at least over the next year, whether it be at the latter half of this offseason or by the trade deadline. I think Rasmus Andersson makes the most sense. I think you need to keep some of these players, but I think for the Flames, going for full fire sale, tearing it down like they have, is the smartest decision. And there are some good prospects coming up here, like Gavin McKenna, Landon Dupont, that I think the Flames would like to have. If I were Calgary, I'm at least keeping Weegar. I think that's somebody that, especially with his age not being too bad at 30 years old, I'd want to see as a veteran for the next generation. But I could absolutely trade Andersson and Kadri if they're making that work. And I think for the Flames, with their rebuild, with their process, they're in a unique spot right now. That's gonna be it for today, guys, and thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that notification bell, hit that comment as well, and let me know down below what you guys think of this Flames roster. What more would you tear down? What more trades would you make if you were in charge of this Flames roster? And who do you see actually being dealt? Where do you see them going? Let me know all your thoughts. And of course, share the video with all the hockey fans and Flames fans you guys know, and click on this card for all of my trade content in one playlist there. I will see you in the next one. Have a great day, and goodbye.